Fantastic. So welcome everybody to our 6 out of 8 sessions of Joseph and Jacob with Rabbi David Silber. We're so happy to be back with you this morning or evening, depending on where you are. As you come into the Zoom room, I will invite you to become a panelist. That just means you can choose to put on your camera if you like. We can see your wonderful smiles. And it means that when Rabbi Silber invites comments and questions, you can unmute and ask yourself. You're also very welcome to put your comments and your questions in the chat. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, we just ask that you put your comments and your questions in the Facebook comments, and I will bring them to the Zoom. When you're not speaking, please keep yourself on mute so that we can all hear each other and it just minimizes background noise. I will be sharing the sources on Sefaria, but you are very welcome and encouraged to follow along in your own Tanakh or your own Sefaria. And with that, over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we're up to chapter 45. Previously, last week, we saw that this is Yehuda's great speech to Yosef, offering himself as a replacement for Binyamin, his brother. And he explains to Yosef the reason. He says, because I made a commitment to my father, our old father, whom Yosef seems concerned about. And if in fact Binyamin is remaining in Mitzrayim with Yosef, it will cause the death of our father. There's even a suggestion it might cause the death of Binyamin. The two are inseparably linked. And that's the gist of his argument. And then he says at the end, and I myself am the guarantor, the Orev, Abdecha Rabatanar, and therefore it's appropriate that I stay instead of Binyamin as a slave, as your servant. And that's Yehuda's great speech. And he ends with, once again, focusing on his father. The last verse, how can I go back, he says, to my father, and the young boy, Binyamin, is Einenu. That's a term that the Torah has used several times for Yosef himself. Lest I see the evil, that will befall my father. So the last word is father. That seems to be the focus of Yehuda. Somehow he picked up on the fact that Yosef, for whatever reason, doesn't know it's Yosef, but seems very concerned about the old father. Is he still alive? And Yehuda, in fact, says he won't be alive if we keep Binyamin here. And furthermore, he also picked up on the fact that for whatever reason, Yosef and his proxy, the man he sends after the brothers, don't want anybody to die. Because initially, when the brothers said, whoever with whomever the goblet is found should die and will be slaves, and the fellow says to them, no, the one that took it will be a slave, and the rest of you can go back in peace. So obviously, for whatever reason, Yosef doesn't want anybody to die. He's slavery, yes, and death, no. That's a theme that will reoccur later on, and actually, it's a theme that we encountered with Yosef himself. Because initially, when the brothers see Yosef, they conspire to kill him. Then Reuven says, let's not kill him with our own hands, let's throw him into the pit. He'll die in the pit. The pit has no water. But then he's picked up from the pit, and then the brothers discuss whether or not to sell Yosef. Yehuda says we can't kill him. In fact, we are killing him. Let's rather sell him as a slave. And then, of course, he is sold as a slave. Whether they did it directly themselves or not is a good question. The simple reading of the text suggests they didn't actually sell him. In any event, so there you have a distinction between killing and slavery. And the brothers seem to at least hear, if not accept, Yehuda's argument that we shouldn't kill our brother. So Yosef, a similar theme occurs with Yosef as well, for whatever reason. He doesn't want anybody to die, he says, just to be a slave. That's the great speech of Yehuda. And now it's a long speech, and now we have another long speech, this time of Yosef, in response to Yehuda's speech. So we'll look at the long speech of Yosef, and of course we'll also notice differences between Yehuda's speech and Yosef's speech. So this is chapter 45. Let's begin. Yosef Joseph could not, he couldn't contain himself. In front of all the people that were standing in front of him. Vayikra, he cries out, calls out, Hotzio kol ish me'olai, remove all people from before me. V'lo amad ishito, b'tzvada Yosef elechav. So no one stood before him when Joseph hitzvada, made himself known to his brethren. Here in this verse, I think you can read it two different ways. In other words, he could not contain himself. The question is, does he want to contain himself? When someone can't contain themselves, it sounds like Joseph is struggling. In other words, there's a piece of Joseph that wants to contain himself, that doesn't want people to know that he in fact is Joseph. But on the other hand, he's going to say in the next verse, I am Joseph. I guess one of the questions we can ask here, when it says he could not contain himself before all those that stand before him, does that mean that he wants to tell the brothers? He's committed to telling the brothers now? That's not a question. He doesn't want to do it publicly. He doesn't want everybody to know. Or does it mean he can't contain himself, that he doesn't really want anybody to know? He's still struggling as to whether or not to reveal his true identity as Yosef. Now this pasuk over here, and he's about to cry out, I am Joseph. So we already remember that there's been a progression over here in terms of Joseph and his crying, because the first time Joseph cries in conjunction with the brothers is when he hears the brothers talking to each other after he's accused them of being spies. He hears the brothers saying, why is this happening to us? It's happening because we're guilty concerning our brother. Because we heard his supplication. But we didn't hear, that is to say, we didn't pay attention to it. We didn't react to it. And when Joseph hears the brothers saying to each other, we are guilty, and then Reuven speaks up. I told you not to do it, says Reuven. I told you not to harm the boy. You didn't listen to me. You didn't listen. And when Joseph hears this, he turns aside and he cries. He doesn't leave the room. He turns aside. Let's find that particular verse in chapter 42. It's verse number 24. He turns aside from them and cries. So he's not walking to a different room, but he cries because he hears that actually some of them, they all feel guilty, and that in fact, there was a disagreement as to whether to harm him or not. Reuven claims, I told you not to do it. Now, Reuven didn't exactly say that, but that's what he says. And now he says, and now his blood is being sought. That is to say, this is happening to us in response to what we did to Yosef. That's the first time he cries in conjunction with the brothers. The next time he cries in conjunction with the brothers is in the previous chapter. It's when he meets Binyamin. Binyamin comes down, that's actually in chapter 43. He sees Binyamin in chapter 43, verse 29. And he says, is this the younger brother? Is this your brother? He says he saw Benjamin, his brother from his mother, Joseph does. Is this your younger brother? And he gives him a blessing. And then in verse number 30, Joseph hurried. Because he had overcome with feelings towards his brother. He was on the verge of tears. He was going to cry. So he goes to a room, a separate room, and he cries there. So you see there already has to leave the room altogether. He can't be in their presence. He has to rush out to a different room. And now we have the third time that Joseph will cry. This is V'lo Yochol Yosef L'Hitapek. This time he can't actually contain himself. There's no time to run to a different room. All he can say is to have some kind of privacy. So he says everybody should leave. And Hotzio Kolish Me'olai, everybody except the brothers leave. But once again, one can raise the question as to whether Joseph, really wants to reveal his identity, but is overcome, or doesn't want to reveal his identity, but is overcome. He can't help himself. So this is, again, and this is what's unusual about the Joseph story. There's a real sense over here of the inner feelings of this character. That Joseph, on one hand, is the one who's seeking his brothers, as he said when he was first sent to find his brothers. He seeks his brothers. On the other hand, he named his son Menashe, for he said forgetfulness. I want to forget my troubles and all of my father's house. So we really have this conflict. And there were good reasons, apart from the fact that his feelings towards his family and his history with his family. There is another reason I want to just put out there right now, that revealing his identity to his brothers may become problematic for Joseph. And that is that Joseph, as far as Egypt is concerned, he's an Egyptian. Safnat Paneach, dresses like an Egyptian, he's married to the priestly family of Egypt, etc. And when the brothers come down to Mitzrayim, this may create, and in fact will create, some problems for Joseph, because Joseph might now be seen as having a loyalty towards his family, which is contradictory to being an Egyptian. This, in fact, will happen, as we'll see later on, not today. In any event, this verse is very striking. Anyway, there was no one except the brothers there. When Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Let's read a couple more verses, then I'll stop and take some comments or questions. And Joseph cried out loud. Can't contain himself. So all of Egypt, Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, and also the house of Paro heard the cry. So he can't actually get the sense over here that he had wanted minimally to reveal himself to the brothers alone, but that can't happen because he's so overcome, again, this inner turmoil of Joseph, that when he cries out so loud, everybody hears, not just his brethren, his brothers, but also the house of Paro as well. Now we have the revelation of Joseph to the brothers. I'll take one more verse. Vayomer Yosef el Echav, ani Yosef, ha'od avi chai. Lo yachlu Echav lanot oto, ki nevaru mipanav. So Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Ha'od avi chai, is my father still alive? This is a question that Joseph had asked earlier. He asked, for example, in chapter 43, verse number 27. When the brothers come down again to Egypt, Joseph inquires of the welfare, the shalom of the brothers. Vayomer, he said, "Shalom avichem hazoken asher martem ha'odenu chai." And Joseph said to them, "Is your old father, is he well? The one that you spoke about, ha'odenu chai, is he still alive? Ha'odenu chai." Over here, Joseph says, "Vayomer Yosef el Echav, ani Yosef, I am Joseph. Ha'od avi chai, is my father still alive?" The brothers can't answer because they are shocked. They're just shocked, amazed and shocked. Here the question we can ask is a fairly obvious question, which is, what do you mean is my father still alive? He asked that question in chapter 43, verse number 27, was it 27 or 28? Verse 27, and they said, yes, Shalom Yavdechali Avino Odenu Chai, and they bowed down. They haven't left Egypt since then. Since they leave then, since that story, they've been in Mitzrayim. They eat with Joseph. He puts the goblet in the sack of Binyamin. They're brought back to Joseph. And we have the long speech of Yehuda. So they haven't left Egypt. So in chapter 43, Joseph asked the question, basically, Oda Vichai, is my father still alive? To which they said yes. So why is Joseph asking here in chapter 45, verse number 3, Ani Yosef Oda Vichai? It just told them previously that our old father is alive and they haven't left. So what is the point of the question? That's his first question. Ani Yosef Oda Vichai. So the point over here is the following, in my view, which is that Yehuda's speech, Joseph's revealing of Joseph to the brothers, follows Yehuda's speech. Yehuda's speech had one main point, which is he never argues for the innocence of Binyamin, never bothers, never goes there. He makes a different point. He says, you, Joseph, have an interest in our old father and this brother. Yes, let me explain about the brother and the father. They are linked together. Nafsho kishura b'nafsho. And if, in fact, you keep Binyamin in Mitzrayim, our father will die. And you don't want our father to die. You keep asking, Oda Vichai, is he alive? So you're interested in being alive. But let me tell you something. If we keep Binyamin here, he won't be alive. That's the main argument of Yehuda. And I would add that he even suggests that maybe Binyamin can't survive without his father. The two are linked, inseparably linked, and he explains why. But his point is, and the point of the story is that Binyamin in the story stands in for Joseph. The description of Binyamin in Yehuda's great speech is exactly the description of Joseph, starting with Ben Zekunim. Binyamin is a Ben Zekunim, and Joseph was described as the Ben Zekunim. Binyamin is the child that's born to his wife. His wife had two children, and the other one is Joseph and one is Binyamin. So the point is, and the power of Yehuda's speech is such that what Joseph is asking is, given the fact, this powerful speech, that if Binyamin is not with our father, he can't survive. And since Binyamin stands in for Joseph throughout the entire narrative, so now Joseph asks the question, Ha'od Avichai, is he really alive? Because given everything you've told me, that the father can't survive without Binyamin, maybe the father can't survive without Joseph, given the fact that Joseph and Binyamin are presented essentially as being virtually identical. So the question, the power of the speech is, okay, I know what you told me before, but now that I've heard your speech, tell me, is my father truly alive? I think that's the power of the speech. It actually creates a picture which may or may not be a reality, but it creates its own reality. And therefore the question, and of course the brothers can't answer. They're so amazed and shocked they can't answer. This would dispel any thinking that the brothers somehow know that it is Joseph. The brothers do not know that it's Joseph. And why would they imagine that a Hebrew slave would become the viceroy of Egypt? It's the result of a very complicated series of events, and Joseph's ability to decipher dreams, and Joseph's ability to find himself standing before Paro, which became possible only because Joseph ended up in jail. Everything that happens to Joseph, in a sense, is leading up to where Joseph is. Even things that appear at the time to be very negative, such as being cast into a pit which has no water. And of course, have no water means you won't drown in the pit. That is true. If the pit is filled with water, you will drown there. So abarek ein bo mayim on one hand means he can survive. On the other hand, if he's not pulled out of the pit, he also will die for lack of food. And then he's pulled out of the pit by passerbys and sent down as a slave to Egypt. So being thrown into the pit, it turns out in retrospect, was positive. That's what the Medrash picks up when Joseph is coming and they say, well, let's kill him and throw him in the pit and let's see what becomes of his dreams. And the Medrash says that let's see what becomes of his dreams. It's a Medrash. It's not stated by the brothers, it's stated by God. God says, oh, really? let's see what becomes of his dreams. And the point, of course, is that's the throwing him into the bar, which allows Joseph to get to Egypt, which allows him to begin his story of moving towards positions of power within Egypt. The bar is a positive step for Joseph, it turns out, and so is the second bar, which is the Beit HaSohar. As Joseph said, but without being in the bar, because of the Potiphar business, he never meets the Sar Mashkim. He never meets the Sar Mashkim, he never gets the Paro. And if the Sar Mashkim forgets Joseph, please get me out of here, says Joseph. And the Sar Mashkim doesn't remember Joseph, terrible thing. No, it's a good thing. Because if he remembers him right away, Joseph gets out of jail, and who knows where Joseph is? But this way, he's still in jail. So the Sar Mashkim says to Paro, in jail, there was this Eved Ivri who could interpret dreams, my dreams and the baker's dreams. So Paro knows where to send. They send the message to the jail, and they rush him out of jail. So the story of Joseph is a complicated story, and things that appear to be negatives, and they are negatives in a certain sense, obviously, but they all turn out to be positives. So there's no way in the world who could imagine such a crazy thing that the younger brother, the slave with crazy dreams, turns out to be the viceroy of Egypt. And therefore, ki nivalu mi panav, nivalu, they're shocked. They're shocked. They don't know what to say. They're dumbfounded. They can't speak. Now, let me stop here for a moment and take comments or questions, if there are comments or questions.
Laszlo has a hand up. Would you like to?
Could it be that there is this great distance between them at the present moment, that Joseph is moved to speak about what is common to them, which is their father? He's reminding them that they are of the same origin, the same place that they come from. It's a way to reach out to them.
Yes, I like that point. It's a good point. It's not contradictory to what I said, but it's a very good point. It's a way of, because he asked it as a question. Yes, of course, that's an excellent point. Some point of connectedness, because they're in different worlds, as we saw earlier. They don't recognize, Joseph recognizes them, we are told in the beginning of the story, and they don't recognize him. But the reason is clear, because they basically, from the narrative standpoint, are the same shepherds that Joseph encountered earlier. So he recognizes them perfectly well, apart from the fact that there are 10 of them. So even aside from that, the point is they're basically the same people. But Joseph has gone through some incredible shifts and changes, different identity, night and day. So they don't recognize him. So yes, he's trying to find the point of tangency. That's a very good point. And the father is a point of tangency, because Yehuda has just expressed in his speech a deep concern for his father, to the degree that he's willing to make himself a slave forever to make sure that his father survives. The old man lives on, etc., and to keep his promise. So Joseph's Oda Vichai is a way to connect to Yehuda's speech and to find that point of connectedness, which then could begin to repair this, the breach that obviously exists between Joseph and his brothers. It's a good point. Anybody else? Yes? All right, so let's continue. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, okay, fine. Let's continue. There's nobody else, right? Okay, so let's continue. Verse number 4. People have comments, they can just unmute themselves. Okay.
I can hear you.
Good.
Wendy Baker.
Okay, good. Vayomer Yosef el Echav Kishuna Elai Vayigashu. Vayomer Ani Yosef Achichem Hashem Mechartem Oti Mitzrayim. So Joseph says in verse number 4, first they just can't speak, they're dumbfounded. Now Joseph begins a long speech. The first thing he says is, Kishuna Elai Vayigashu, come close to me. That's how the previous speech started, Vayigash Elav Yehuda. I mentioned last week that Vayigash to draw near, to draw close, often carries with it a sense of trying to be connected, trying to be closer. And that's what Joseph says, come close to me. You can see them like standing back and be out of shock. Come close. And of course, the place that Joseph will ultimately want his brothers to settle in is the land of Goshen, the land of closeness. So we have Vayigash of Yehuda. Now Joseph says, says Joseph, Ani Yosef achichem, I am Joseph, your brother, Hashem b'chartem oti mitzrayma, that you sold to Egypt. Now, the point is, he's telling them on one hand, I'm familiar with the story. Nonetheless, I'm the one that you sold unto Egypt. So those that believe that the brothers actually sold Joseph, because that's one view. Rashi, the Midrash has that the brothers actually sell Joseph. He hasn't said the Midianites, but the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, perhaps are the same people, etc., that the brothers actually did the sale. They can rely on this verse. I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold to Egypt. The Rashbam, who believes the opposite, that the brothers did not, in fact, sell Joseph, but he says, I'm Joseph that you sold to Egypt. He says that you caused my sale. It's also possible, by the way, that Joseph doesn't know that the brothers weren't behind the sale. How would he know that? Maybe the brothers contracted with these Midian. All Joseph is in the bottom of a pit. He can't see anything. People draw him out of the pit. So Joseph can't know whether the brothers actually did the sale or are the cause of the sale. But in effect, they are, according to the Rashbam, the cause of the sale. If he's not in the pit, he doesn't get sold. Now, by the way, I just want to point out that if the brothers don't sell Joseph, in other words, the sale of Joseph is not, in other words, the sale of Joseph, which is not clear whether the brothers did it or not, is not intended, in my view, to make the brothers look better. In other words, the fact of the matter is, if they don't sell him, he dies. The two alternatives in the Joseph story are either Joseph dies in a pit because there's no water, or in fact, he will be sold. So the sale of Joseph, per se, is, of course, better than leaving him in the pit. On the other hand, if the brothers don't actually sell him, but rather he's picked up in the interim by other people, and we don't even know if the brothers necessarily intended to sell him. All it says is that when Judah speaks, by Yishma'u Echav, the brothers heard. Now, sometimes the verb shama has many meanings. It can mean to hear. It can mean to accept. So the point is, according to Rashi, that the brothers actually sold them. Rashi says, by Yishma'u Echav, the brothers accepted. Rashi has to say that because they did sell him, according to Rashi. But if they didn't actually sell him, but he was sold in the interim, and it's not necessary to conclude that by Yishma'u Echav that the brothers accepted it. Maybe they heard what Judah says, they're thinking about it. And in the interim, someone else picks him up and someone else sells him. So again, there's no conclusive proof from this particular verse that the brothers actually did sell him. And the point of the Rashbam is whether they actually sold him or not is not important for the Rashbam. You're responsible because you set up the possibility. And in fact, you set up even a worse possibility. So one way or the other, we can read the verse either way, I think. They actually did sell him, or they caused this sale, or they made possible the sale. And that's another possibility. Okay. So now Joseph continues to speak. This is a long speech, as was Judah's. Yes.
Hi, it's Sandra. Just one point before you go into the speech. So if you're saying that on the two poles of yes, they did sell him, or they caused his sale, your point about responsibility is, and I guess that's Rashbam's also. I mean, that should be primary, shouldn't it? Because isn't that the byword of this entire event? I mean, Yehuda took responsibility. I am the Eravon. He finally stepped up here, which is, as you said eloquently, Tamar, his Rabbi, taught him that lesson. So if the lesson, the primary lesson of this entire saga is standing up and taking responsibility, then the Rashbam explanation and yours that you just agreed to is that it's whether or not they actually sold him, they have to accept the responsibility for it. And
I
that's
agree. Yeah,
that's why
agreed.
Joseph says, Asher machartem oti mitzrayma. To him, it's the same thing, whether he knows or not that he was.
Right.
To him, it's the same effect. Stand up and bear responsibility.
Right, I agree. It really doesn't matter whether they actually did it or not. They're responsible one way or the other. Yeah, agreed, 100%. We total agreement on that. Okay, so Joseph continues now to speak. It's a long speech. V'ata al te'atzvu v'yichar b'einechem ki mechartem otihena ki l'mechya shlachani Elohim lifnechem. Now, this is actually a very interesting question over here. Joseph says, Al te'atzvu v'yichar b'einechem. Now, don't be te'atzvu, don't be distressed, and don't get angry. Now, the combination of distress and anger, we had that earlier in the Torah, in the story of Dinah. The brothers, when they hear about Dinah, we're told they are very, very upset, very distressed, and also very angry. And that led to bloodshed, that led to conflict. It's not clear over here what Joseph has in mind. Don't be upset, distressed, or angry, because that often leads to violence. I don't believe, though, that Joseph is concerned, as some Midrashim think, that the brothers may attack Joseph. These are strangers in the land of Egypt, the gigantic land of Egypt, who are essentially powerless. There's no sense they have any power. Maybe Joseph means something else. Joseph has heard already that the brothers had disagreements about what to do. Reuven spoke up and said, I told you not to do it, which is why Joseph takes Shimon as the hostage, son number 2, as opposed to son number 1. He knows that Judah, it would appear, perhaps also, he doesn't know for sure, but Judah's speech suggests that maybe he's someone who has some sense of responsibility for a brother, which he did have some sense of responsibility for a brother. He says, you don't kill your brother. He didn't say you don't sell your brother. So maybe what Joseph is getting at over here is the use of the distress and anger combination, which is always ends up in violence. In fact, Cain is also that way. Torah uses similar terms with Cain when God did not accept his. He was very angry, his face fell, presumably distressed, and that leads to the killing of his brother. So maybe what Joseph is concerned about over here is not so much they're going to attack Joseph. They have no power to attack Joseph. Maybe he's concerned about something else. They shouldn't attack each other because that could easily happen. But there were deep disagreements about what to do with Joseph. But Joseph says, don't be distressed, don't be angry that you sold me here. This is a very important pasuk. It says a lot about Joseph. Because God, Elohim shlachani, sent me before you to bring life, to sustain life, to save life. And this is actually a very interesting question in the Joseph story in general. Now, what Joseph is saying is, and he repeats this more than once, that you may have thought X, but God had a different plan. The term he uses actually is, in terms of the brothers, he uses the word mechartem initially. You sold me here. But when he talks about God, he uses the verb shlachani, God sent me here. This is part of a divine plan, says Joseph. That's what Joseph is all about from the very beginning. Joseph understands himself as being part of a divine plan. The question is, and this comes up at the very end of the book as well, in chapter 50, when Joseph says, listen, you did a terrible thing in selling me, but this is part of God's plan. Therefore, I'm going to forgive you. And this raises a very interesting question in general about, I intend to do something bad, but it turned out good. But that wasn't my intention. I had bad intentions. But then it turned out good. Does this necessarily sort of get me off the hook? Do I then say, well, since it turned out well, okay, so I did nothing wrong. Now over here, it's quite extreme. Selling your brother for money is the capital crime in the Torah. Joseph says it doesn't matter because God had God's plan. We'll come back to this again. This is actually an extremely interesting question that comes up in different settings within that tradition. But that's what Joseph says. He's going to repeat this theme as well. He continues, for 2 years of famine have passed. They're already 2 years of famine. They're going to be 5 more years of a famine. There'll be no reaping, there'll be no harvesting. In Charish v'Kotzir. And now he repeats it. And God has sent me before you to ensure sherit, your survival, that you can still survive. A remnant of you will survive in the land. And to enable you to prosper or to survive and have a great deliverance. Now he continues, V'yata. So now, Lo atem shlachtem otihena. You didn't send me here, Ki Elohim, but rather God sent me here. Vayisimeni la'av l'paro u'ladon l'chol beito u'moshel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. So that verse number 8 has 2 parts. The first part of verse number 8, he makes it an even more striking statement. You didn't actually send me here, he says. You're just part of God's plan. God sent me here. Lo atem shlachtem. You didn't send me. 3 times that God has sent me here. Shlachtem otihena. It's rather amazing when you think about it. And again, it raises the question about whether this necessarily exculpates the brothers. The brothers did cause his sale, or maybe they even sold him. But says Joseph, no, you didn't do that. You're just part of a bigger plan. Now, it certainly is true that that this is God's plan, because we know that God has a plan that the Jewish people will have to undergo, the covenantal people will have to undergo Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. And this is where that's going to happen. Mitzrayim will be the place of Gerut, Avdut, and Inui. And in fact, the idea that God has sent us down to Mitzrayim, we have this. Let's find that we have it earlier when we have it ready when Joseph is being sent to find his brothers. It's so that Yaakov tells Joseph to find his brothers. By Yishlacheu me'emek Hebron, he sent him from the valley of Hebron by Avosh Hebron in verse number 37. And then some mysterious person finds Joseph wandering. He's lost. What are you searching for? Searching for my brothers. No, he's left. And Joseph, they've gone to Dotan. And Joseph tries to find his brothers in Dotan. So in a certain sense, this Ish, who represents God, presumably, this mysterious Ish, is sending Joseph to Dotan, which means sending Joseph out of the land, sending Joseph to the place Dotan, the place of quarrel or trouble, from which he will end up in Egypt. So this is Joseph, but here you have, it's interesting, here you have really different philosophy that Joseph expresses, that this is all part of a divine plan. It's almost as if Joseph is saying, it's not necessarily your fault because this has to happen anyway, sort of foreknowledge and free will. There's no choice. This is God's plan, and you are simply part of God's plan as I am part of God's plan. That's what Joseph says. It raises some very interesting moral questions, I think. That's point number 1. And then the second point I wanted to make is the second half of verse number 8. This is a wonderful speech. The speech really says you a lot about the person making the speech. So the second half of the speech is, first half is you didn't send me here. This is a divine mission. And then Joseph, verse number 8, part 2. Vayisimeni la'av l'paro u'li'adon l'chol beito u'moshel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. And
Rabbi
God
Silber,
has
Rabbi Silber, the idea of la'av paro, it was the inflated side of him once again, as the time he went out to look for his brothers. He was the son in the proverbial son in the palace, actually. But he said, I was the Av to the Adon.
Right, agreed. So the point over here is, the question is, when Joseph describes himself now, I'm the Av, I'm like Paro's father figure. Remember when he was paraded around Egypt, they said Avrech, whatever Avrech means. It's curious, Avrech. I'm an Av to Paro. I'm a master of his house. I'm a ruler over the land of Egypt. That's the way Joseph sees himself. And in point of fact, to pick up on Rosie's comment, the fact of the matter is, well, there are 2 points. The first question would be, is this actually true? Is he actually an Av Paro, an Adon L'chol Beito, and a Moshe B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim? There's no doubt that he has enormous amount of power, that he's paraded through Egypt, they bow down to him, he's in charge of the food, and all that is true. But the point is, he has all that power because as Paro said, Ani Paro, I am Paro, and no one is greater in Egypt than you except for me. But in point of fact, the power of Joseph is contingent on Paro. The moment that Paro doesn't need Joseph anymore, suddenly Joseph will find himself with zero power, none power whatsoever. And what's interesting over here is the speech of Joseph about the way he sees himself. And Av Paro, and Adon L'chol Beito, and Moshe B'chol Mitzrayim has a very striking parallel to the speech that Joseph makes to Mrs. Potiphar. When Mrs. Potiphar propositions Joseph in chapter 39, and Joseph responds, and the response is very interesting because it picks up on all the sides of Joseph, the big positives and also the problematic side. Because Mrs. Potiphar said, "Shechvayim, sleep with me." That's in chapter 39, verse number 7. Vayima'en, Joseph refuses. Vayomro eshet Adonah, he said to his master's wife, "Hein Adoni, look here," she says, "my master lo yoda iti ma babayit, v'chol asher yesh lo notan biyodi." My lord Potiphar doesn't know what I do in the house, and all that he has placed under my control. Now, of course, that's exactly what she's thinking. She sees Joseph rising to power. She sees in verse number 6 that Potiphar has abandoned everything into Joseph's hands. And she says, let's get together. And what he says to her is, well, look, he says, he doesn't know what goes on in the house, implying, as she probably hears it, if he doesn't know what goes on in the house, so we'll never know what happens between us. Then he says, and everything is placed into my hand. She's probably nodding her head. That's right. Essentially replace him. Then in verse number 9, there's nobody greater than me, he says. The only thing, I have everything. The only thing I don't have is you. And she's nodding away. That's right. You've taken everything except for me. So let's complete the deal. But my point is, and then he says, but how could I do this? It would be wrong. Now, the point is, you can read the speech in many ways, but one way to read the speech is, the bottom line is he says no, and it's a great moment for Joseph. But the question is how he actually sees himself. And in point of fact, he sees himself as there's nobody greater than me, I can do whatever I want, etc., etc. And a few verses later, he finds himself in jail. So how much power did he actually have? In other words, his master doesn't care about anything except the lechem. But it turns out that in the narrative of Joseph, the lechem is the critical piece. Pharaoh has bad dreams because he had to execute the man in charge of the lechem. So the point over here I'm making about the speech of Joseph is, and what is different than Judah's speech. Judah says, "Take me as a slave." What Joseph, in the long speech of Joseph, and why we need a long speech here is a very good question. But the fact of the matter is, he talks a lot, and you get a sense of how he sees himself. That is, it's all for the best, he says, because look at me, look how important I am. But in point of fact, one could make the argument, I think a strong argument, that Joseph has a very bad understanding of his actual power. He has power because he's useful to somebody, to the people in power. But when the moment they don't need you, you're gone. And it's one of the many themes of the Joseph story that Megillah Esther picked up on in terms of Achashverosh. If he needs you, or he thinks he needs you, to have a lot of power. And the moment he doesn't need you anymore or suspects you in the slightest, you're out of there, you're finished. At the Megillah picked up on it. So over here, we have Joseph talking about himself. And of course, I would argue that it is a incorrect assessment of his own position in the land of Egypt. He's trying to tell the brothers it's all for the best, which is very nice. But the fact that he emphasizes the Av, the Adon, the Moshel, this is a question. It's a problem. Let me stop here for a moment. If any comments or questions, I'll take them and then we'll finish the speech.
Rabbi, can I ask something?
Of course.
What Yosef said, Yosef could have taken it in two different ways. He could have said, you were bad, you tried to do terrible, terrible things for me, but I am very lucky that Hashem made it come out right. But Yosef is saying it on a much, much higher level. He really could have said that. He's saying, this is all part of God's plan and it wasn't your fault. And that's, to me, that's like a very, very high level, because he could have looked at it the other way, that Hashem protected me despite what you intended to do.
That's right. He does do that. And he does it later even more so. He says at the very end of chapter 50, "Atem chashevtem olai ra'ah." You thought to do evil, but Elohim chashav l'tova. But God thought good. In other words, you're part of some. It's a kind of view of history that's very striking. It's sort of deterministic. In other words, it's going to happen, and therefore
He's taking away their blame. He takes away their blame.
He takes away their blame. However,
very high level.
He does take away their blame, but on the other hand, he does make the point that you thought to do evil. You didn't do evil. That's what he says later.
Right.
It's very, I find it interesting. Here's the point. If someone says, look, I know you meant bad, but it all turned out for the best. You know, I remember I was talking about this recently, and someone said to me, it was in Israel recently, and we're talking about this, does this let the brothers off the hook? And I commented, there is a Gemara, there's a parasha in the Chumash about a woman or a girl who takes a vow, takes a neder. In the Chumash, the father or the husband, on the day that he hears about the vow, can actually annul the vow, called Hafarat Nedarim. It's the beginning of Parashat Mato. It says, if in fact, and the Torah says, if he annuls the vow, then Hashem Yislachla, then God will forgive her for the non-fulfillment of the vow, Kieni Avia Ota, because the father has prevented her from fulfilling the vow. God will forgive her. So the Gemara has a problem. What do you mean God will forgive her? Why does she need forgiveness? Now I have something to say about that, but let me tell you what the Gemara says about it. Rabbi Akiva says the case is talking about the following. The case is talking about a woman who took a vow. And the father or the husband heard about the vow, and the day that he hears about it, he annulled the vow. So the vow doesn't exist anymore. But she doesn't know this. She doesn't know that the vow was annulled, and then she breaks the vow. Says Rabbi Akiva, Hashem Yislachla. God will forgive her, but there was no vow. That's true, but she didn't know it. Then Rabbi Akiva says, and if someone who did nothing wrong actually thought she was doing wrong requires forgiveness, how much more so the one who actually does wrong? But Rabbi Akiva's position is very interesting. I don't think it's the pshat in the Chumash. It doesn't matter. He's making a different point, that if someone intends to do evil, even though they did no evil whatsoever, they still require forgiveness. That would seem to run counter to what Yosef is saying, because what Yosef seems to be saying is, in point of fact, it was all good. Yes, you thought to do evil. And I would say that, objectively speaking, selling or causing your brother's sale or attempting to kill your brother in the eyes of the Torah is certainly a very bad thing. So what Joseph is saying is not so simple. And here's the point I wanted to make about it. And we'll get to this when we get to the end of the book, whenever that will be. That is that we have to remember that Joseph and the brothers, at the end of the day, and Joseph speaks to his brothers at the end of the book, take my bones back to bury me together with you, we'll reunite after all that. In point of fact, one can make a very strong case, and we will make the case, that Joseph and the brothers, there always remains tension between them. In point of fact, the people of Israel are divided, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. You have Yehuda and you have Ephraim in the north, or Joseph in the north. So the fact of the matter is, the tensions are never fully allayed, and the brothers don't trust him. At the very end, they still think, after everything, he's going to kill them. So the point is, when you hear someone say to you, I know you meant bad, but God, but it's all for the best. That was God's plan. I know about you, but for me, I would hear that a little differently. I would say that, okay, it's part of God's plan, but he still thinks I did bad. In other words, I mean, in point of fact, there is that tension that always exists, and we'll deal with this later. So, but you're right. That's what Joseph is saying. Joseph is saying that he's operating on a different plane over here. He's saying, well, what you did doesn't really matter, he says. All that matters is the plan of God, and we're all part of God's plan. I was thinking about this just as a side point, just after Purim, thinking about Purim for a long time, and one of the shiurim I gave on Purim, and it's in the book also, is that a different way to read the Megillah. I claim you can read the Megillah that God is not just secondary or hidden, but God is actually at the center. That the entire Megillah is really a war of God against Amalek, and the people in the story are God's pawns. God's pawns to set up the battle to destroy Amalek. And I was thinking about that. Actually, the more I think about it, and I'm more and more convinced that's a very good reading of the Megillah. We'll leave that for now. I'm not going to go back to that. But I was thinking that actually the strange business of drinking on Purim until you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. Adu lo yada between Haman and Mordechai. What does that mean? I mean, it could mean that even this obvious difference, you're so drunk, you can't tell black and white. But you can't tell black from white. That's how drunk you are. That's one way to read it. But I was thinking that from another perspective, maybe it means something else. That at the end of the day, it's not Mordechai and Haman that actually matter. God has a plan. And God's plan is going to happen one way or the other. That in a certain sense, everybody is part of this divine plan. And that, I think, is what Yosef is basically saying to them. God has a plan. That's the idea of the Nazir. I have a mission, that God sent me on God's mission. And that's going to happen one way or the other. So it's just a different way to see the world. But I think that question that you're raising is a pretty basic question. It comes up in many contexts. I mentioned Rabbi Akiva specifically because you see exactly the opposite. There's someone who did nothing wrong. The vow doesn't exist anymore. And yet Rabbi Akiva says, Vashem Yislachu, she still requires atonement. All right. Let me, we still have some more time here. So 20 minutes. So let me finish up the speech of Joseph. Unless someone else has a comment. Otherwise, we'll finish Joseph's speech over here.
Yeah, I think Laszlo has a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a comment. Also, this part of the speech also shows Joseph's ambivalence, because at the same time that he is trying to get his brothers to come closer to him, he also points out the enormous gap between them. He points to his, I am greater than you are, I'm greater than anybody. And that doesn't bring people closer to you.
It's why they tried to kill him in the first place, actually. I mean, that's true. I mean, that's the point. Right, exactly. It's a speech like that, and my point I was making, that is certainly true. And I was adding, in addition to that, I don't think he's right. I mean, I think maybe at the very end, if we get to the very end, he comes to a different understanding. He's certainly right about a mission, but I don't think he yet understands the nature of the mission. He thinks the mission is wholly to benefit people, to enable them to live lachayot lochem and all that. And on the other hand, one can see the mission as very different, which Joseph will see it. Namely, the mission was to bring you down to Egypt to begin the covenantal agreement, which involves slavery, involves persecution, and involves being a stranger, etc. Gave with Abdut and Inui, and that Joseph, in a certain sense, is the first slave. That's what Joseph comes to realize at the very end of his life. But he's not there yet. At this point, his intentions are to try to smooth things over. But as we all see, when you speak in this way, it doesn't necessarily work. And I would add, in contrast to Judah, Judah says, "Take me as a slave." Judah says, "I have nothing to say. We have no way to justify ourselves." That's what he said. Banis tadak. There are no words. He doesn't try to defend anything. And then he says, "Okay, I'm responsible. I took responsibility. My father is this way, and that's the way he is. For better or worse, that's who he is. And we are responsible, and I am responsible to Avi. And therefore, take me as a slave." And one might say that the slave becomes the king. It's at that moment that Joseph breaks down. And Joseph says, okay, it says the fighting over Benjamin. And Judah versus Joseph. Joseph wants to keep Benjamin, and Judah wants to send Benjamin back. At the end of the day, Judah wins. Judah breaks Joseph down. But the striking difference in the one who says, I'm the greatest, Adon, Moshe, Av, and the other guy who says, take me as an Evid, because I don't want to see other people suffering. That's the contrast is very striking. Two long speeches. Now let's continue. Now we have verse number 9. Maharu varu elavi. Now he continues. It says, hurry up, Maharu, hurry, alu elavi, go up to my father. Famartem elav. Ko amar bin Yosef. Samani Elohim liyadon l'chol Mitzrayim. Reda Eli al Tamod. So this is a verse that I don't know about you, but I find it a little bit problematic. Hurry up and go up to my father and tell him, Ko Amar bin Yosef, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me a ruler over Egypt. Come down to me, al tamod, do not delay, no delay. I would make a couple of points about this verse. First of all, I would say, if I were Jacob, or maybe Jacob won't say this, maybe he's thinking this, maybe the brothers think is, what's the rush? You've waited 20 some odd years. Hello? Suddenly there's a big rush. Right? That's number one. Suddenly it has to be rushed. Maru. Now there's a way to answer that as well, but let's raise the question at least. Number two, I'll tell you what bothers me in this verse more than anything else is Ko Amar bin Yosef. Thus says your son Joseph. Ko Amar. Ko Amar is an expression that we have throughout the Bible. It's one that is found often in the prophetic writings. Ko Amar in Chumash. Ko Amar Hashem. Thus says the Lord. Ko Amar. I haven't checked all the Ko Amars. Most of them are statements made in God's name, proclamations made in God's name. Ko Amar bin Yosef. Thus says your son Joseph. God has made me a master over Egypt. Reda Eli al Tamod. Come down to me, al Tamod. Do not delay, do not stand still, do not stop. And to me,
it's very
problematic.
Pompous.
What?
It's very pompous.
It's extremely pompous, and he's talking to his father, no less. He's not talking to anybody, not to his brothers. He's talking to Yaakov Avinu here. What is this? Reda Eli al Tamod. You know, it strikes me as somebody, I hate to say it, but somebody quite full of himself, and come down without delay. His father's been sitting in mourning for 20 some odd years, you know, maybe waiting for some contact, maybe hoping something will turn up, doesn't know anything. And suddenly we get, it's the Ko Amar and it's the Maharu. It's suddenly he's in a rush. Well, you're in a rush all of a sudden. That's very nice. So
Rabbi,
yes.
Rabbi, I don't know that his father's been in mourning for 20 years, and certainly Joseph doesn't know that because he's had no contact. I think the story has a different perspective.
But we do know he's in
Joseph
mourning. Jacob said, I'm in mourning till the grave. Jacob says,
Joseph has had no contact. He didn't contact them until his brothers showed up. The name of his children indicate that he had no contact.
He has no contact. That is true.
Yeah.
He has no contact.
So he has no idea whether his father was part of the conspiracy to get rid of him or not until his brothers show up. I think
I don't believe that.
Confrontation with his brothers.
That is no. That's some people have such a thing. That's simply a misreading of the Chumash. Yo Benun suggests such a thing. That's not possible. He knows his father's not part of the conspiracy. That is nonsense, actually. I know Yoel says that. That's simply wrong. He doesn't think he's part of the conspiracy. You could say something else. Jacob does set it up in effect. But no, there's no sense that he's concerned about his father. He said several times, Oda Vichai, he's very worried about his father. He knows his father loved him, his father favored him. It's true what you say that Jacob, in effect, did set it up. But my point is, at the end of the day, he's expressed concern about his father. There's no question about that. And we know that Jacob is in mourning.
There was another point that I was going to make is that Joseph has come to a realization that God's plan has him as an integral part. And I think it begins when he's in the pit and when he's confronted with Potiphar's wife. Because when he does the dream interpretations for the Pharaoh, he says, it's not me interpreting them, it's God's words coming through me. So there's a humility at that point. I don't think that he's pompous. I think he's sending a message to his father, look how proud you can be of me now that you know that I'm alive. I don't see the pomposity in that statement.
I see it in terms of he's ordering his father, hurry up, Dad, and get down here. I'm great. You can, yes, he is concerned about his father. There's no question about it. You see this earlier as well, how he describes this, and there's no need for all this. The verse is totally superfluous. Tell my father I'm alive, and I would love to see him. But the point is, I would say two things. First of all, there's no need for the long speech. The same thing with Mrs. Potiphar. He said no, and now he explains it very nicely. But the fact of the matter is, she hears it very differently, which is why she propositions him every single day. She doesn't stop. She's not hearing a no. She's hearing, she says, he's mocking me, he's taunting me. And I think when people speak, they have to understand how they're being heard. But I think, yes, when you look at the speech of Yehuda versus Yosef, there is something about you. There's a reason people don't like him, okay? Let's not forget that. They don't like him. They don't trust him. And there's a reason for it. And these psukim tell you everything about it. On one hand, he says, I forgive you. But on the other hand, he has to talk about how important he is. And it's really superfluous. And the Ko-Amar bothers me as well. He's talking to his father. There has to be there's a lack of humility over here. Now, when you say that God did it and not me, yes, you can read it that way. On the other hand, when he says to the Sarah Mashkim, listen, interpretations of dreams are God's province, tell your dream to me. What he's saying is what Paro says to Joseph. God speaks through you, which happens to be the truth. It is the truth. But I wouldn't necessarily call that humility. I mean, I would say that, yes, it's not me. Elohim Yaned Shalom Paro. But I know what God is thinking. And it will turn out at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, he doesn't exactly know what God is thinking. He knows some of what God is thinking. But the real reason that the brothers are in Mitzrayim, Joseph doesn't know yet. He will know it at the very end of this book, namely, to enslave the Jewish people as part of a covenantal promise. That's what happens over here. So yes, the feeding them, all that business is true, but that's not the real deep reason, as we will see. But we'll get there. But again, the Chumash you can read this verse. That's what's interesting about the story in different ways. But to me, there's something about Yosef which is problematic in this speech and in the Potiphar speech as well. Okay, let's continue now we have a few minutes. Let's continue with the next pasuk. I don't finish the speech. It says, now he continues. Yoshav to be Eretz Goshen. Here he talks about Eretz Goshen. This is what they should tell their father. Yito karov elai, and you will be near me. Ata ubanecha ubnei banecha, v'tzoncha uvekarcha v'chol asher lach. You will dwell in Goshen. I call Goshen the land of Vayigash, the land of closeness. You will send the message to my father. This is what Joseph is saying. You, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all that is yours. That's pasuk Yud. Fine. And then let's wait one more pasuk. Next one, 11. And I will provide for you there. The 5 years of famine. Lest you and your whole household may suffer. Tivoresh, become poor. That's the next thing. So he sends a message to Yaakov, to his father, come down right away. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide food for you, your family, etc., and all that you possess, which is very lovely. And yes, Joseph feels responsible for the family. Very good. There is one thing over here, though, that is curious, and the Chumash will pick up with it later. And Joseph says, tell my father to come down to Mitzrayim. I'm going to protect you, going to provide for you, not just for you. In verse number 10, for you and for your children and for your grandchildren and for your flocks and all that you possess. And here, there is an opening for problems, which will happen later on. After Jacob dies, you remember the very end of the book, the brothers say to each other, our father has died, and now Joseph is going to repay us for all the evil that we did to him. That's chapter 50. So they go to Joseph. First, they send a message to Joseph. Your father said before he died to forgive them. And then they come to Joseph in chapter 50. They fall in front of Joseph. They say, we will be your slaves. We will be your slaves. And the question that can be asked, and we'll get there hopefully someday, in the last chapter, why do they think that the moment Jacob dies, that Joseph's going to take revenge and basically kill them? They think Joseph plans to kill them. That's why they go in front of Joseph and they say, take us as your slaves. There again, you have the killing versus slavery. After Jacob dies, the brothers believe that Joseph is going to kill them. That's what they believe. That's pretty explicit in the Chumash. And there's a reason they believe it. And I'll tell you the reason they believe it. The reason they believe it is actually verse number 10 that we just read. Send the message to my father. Come down to Egypt. I'm going to take care of you and your children and your grandchildren and all that you possess. The children of Jacob are standing in front of Joseph right now. What do you mean? Tell our father I'm going to help you and his children. So that what they're hearing is he's never going to do anything. He's not going to harm us because of Jacob. Is the father still alive? Is Joseph's first words. If the father's still alive after me, that's how they're hearing it. You can argue all you want, but that's how they hear it. And as long as Jacob is alive, they're safe. And it reminds me, but the moment Jacob dies, he never made a promise to them. He made a promise to Jacob and his children and his grandchildren, his possessions. What if there is no Jacob? What if Yaakov has died? And it reminds me very much, and we'll come back to this later, what we remember in terms of Esav and Yaakov. After Yaakov took the blessings of Esav, what did Esav say? Yikrevu yimei Evel avi, v'argad Yaakov achi. After my father dies, the morning of my father, when they come, I will kill my brother Jacob. And that's exactly what the brothers suspect Joseph of. No, I'm not saying Joseph intends this. I'm not saying that. He does not intend to harm them, no question. But the way he frames it over here, tell our father, my father, he says, by the way, tell my father to rush down here. I'm going to take care of him and his children, grandchildren, etc. The Chilkalti otcha, singular, in verse number 11, I would provide for you. And therefore, I don't want your household to want. What they hear later on is it was a commitment to Yaakov, the man that he's concerned about. How is my father? Very concerned about Yaakov. Loves Yaakov. Of course, does not suspect Yaakov is part of anything. Loves Yaakov. But they never committed directly to them. That's what they think over here. So the speech is interesting. We'll pick up with this later on. Let's just finish the speech. Then he continues. And you, your own eyes can see. And my brother Benjamin's eyes. Here he distinguishes Benjamin from the others, that I, in fact, am speaking to you. I would say, certainly, the way Joseph speaks now is the way they remember Joseph from early on. The dreams, the sun, moon, star bowing down, etc. And now we have the last verse. Tell my father about all my high status in Egypt. Tell my father all of my kvodi, my high station, all the honor that I have in Egypt. Tell him all you have seen. Hurry up. Now we have the mihartem. In verse number 9, began with maharu. Mihartem. Hurry up, rush. And bring my father down here. So Joseph's speech ends with Avi, and Judah's speech ends with Avi. And what a difference between the speech of Joseph and the speech of Judah. So this, I think, what I love about the speech over here is how at the very same time, is the greatness of the Chumash, at the very same time, you have Joseph being magnanimous towards his brothers. They did try to kill him. And he is forgiving. There's no question. He's forgiving. He's going to take care of them. He's going to protect them, etc. Care for them. again, there was a question as to Joseph is as a kind of internal turmoil. Should he reveal his identity? Should he not? At the end of the day, it's the piece of Joseph that wants to reunite with his brothers. There's no question. Having said all that, is the other side of Joseph, which is his own sense of self. And whether it's justified or not is a separate question. But the sense of, I am the most powerful, I'm the Av, I'm the Adon, I'm the Moshel. The last verse, tell my father, Kvodi, all of my kavod, etc. And on top of all that, Ko Amar to his father. And on top of all that, the commitment that he makes essentially is to his father. He's not committing primarily to the brothers. He's going to keep them all alive, but it becomes very clear, beginning in the 9th pasuk, that he sees fundamentally the obligation to the old father, Avi, Ma'aruv alu Avi, and tell my father, he got it to Avi at Kol Kvodi b'Mitzrayim. When you read it in context of Judah's speech, it's quite different. Judah is concerned about father's welfare, and he says, take me as a slave. I'll be an Eved. And Joseph is quite the opposite. And of course, the irony is that at the end of the day, the leading brother, king actually, is not Joseph. At the end of the day, Judah becomes the king. It's the one who's willing to be the slave who becomes the melech, actually. And Joseph, with all his amazing talents, and Joseph is, of course, absolutely necessary to be included in the family. That's critical. And that's when Jacob comes down to Egypt. That's Jacob's main task, to find a way to include Joseph in the family. That's Yaakov's role. Joseph is incredibly important for the family with all his talents, and he comes to a different understanding at the end of his life. But what I like about the speech is what I love about the Chumash, which is it's complicated. People are complicated. It's never black and white. And the brothers are hearing the speech, and they're also hearing something else, which of course is true, which is that in the course of what's happened, he favors Binyamin over the other brothers. That is certainly the case. And he says, he's about to favor them, demonstrate his favoritism even more. We'll pick up with this next week. Okay, so we'll stop at this point. If there are any comments, we have a couple of minutes. And next week we'll continue with the Joseph's revealing himself to the brothers, and Jacob hears, and Jacob then sets out to go to Mitzrayim.
I have comments.
Yes, go ahead.
Which are the tribes that survive to move forward way beyond Joseph's tribe, Judah? Joseph's tribe doesn't survive. But his Judah does.
Well, it's certainly the case that whatever.
None of us are descended from Joseph. But
well, we don't know what happens to the lost tribes. Is a good question. Are they really all lost or not? But your point is well taken. At the end of the day, it's Yehuda who is primarily represents the Jewish people. I mean, Yehuda and Levi, Leah's children. Yehuda and Levi are the two main pillars of the Jewish community after the exile. We of course in our prophetic writings talk about reunification of Joseph and Judah, and that's of course we all pray for the reunification of Joseph and Judah, wherever these tribes may be. Are they really all lost or not, or whatever? So who knows? But you're certainly correct in saying that at the end of the day, the kingship comes from Judah, the priesthood comes from Levi, and Joseph, with all his talents, and the whole northern kingdom, which is most of Israel, is called the kingdom of Joseph, basically, Ephraim. What happens to them? Are they really all lost or not? Maybe not, maybe yes, but hopefully someday we're reunited. Joseph and Judah are the two most significant children of Jacob within the narrative, there's no question, and they both are incredibly important, and they're both heroic, but they're also extremely different, and each one, of course, is complicated. There's no such thing as black and white in the Chumash, never. And certainly not in the case of Judah, and certainly not in the case of Joseph. But what makes it a great story. But we'll continue with the story. We're not finished with it, and Joseph has to come to a different understanding, which he will come to a different understanding by the time this book is concluded. Okay, so we'll stop at this point, and we'll hopefully continue next week with the pickup again. Joseph continues to speak, and then we have Yaakov's response and the great chapter 46. I hope we get there next week. If not, we'll get there in the last session. Thank you once again. Anybody who has send me emails, dsilber@risha.org. You can always send me next questions.
Rabbi Silber, I understand the clock was moved. That's why. I wasn't aware of it. Such a pity.
Oh, yes. Oh, I thought it was sent out a notice. Yeah, we moved the clock. Yeah, now sorry about that.
We did not move the clock. Yeah, yet.
Israel didn't move. It's always 6 hour difference now.
Yeah.
The next 2 weeks is always 6 hours difference. Yeah. Sorry about that. All right then. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber, and thank you everyone for your amazing comments and questions. I mean, at the end of the class, there was such an amazing flurry of comments, interesting comments in the chat. So it's amazing, everyone. Just some announcements before we go. Unfortunately, Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lieben's Midrash class.
No, one second. I'm going to teach that class.
Yeah. So it's unfortunately due to a time change and a bit of a mix-up and his flight schedule, he won't be teaching that class, but instead Rabbi David Silber will be teaching a Parsha class at the same time, which is 1 p.m. on the same Zoom link. If you're signed up for the Midrash class, you can just join us in that regular Zoom link.
What day is that? I'm sorry.
This is today.
Today,
So
45
normally,
minutes.
yeah,
I'm just substituting because it was a last second glitch. So I'll just give a class on the Parsha. It's not Dr. Levin's class. I mean, he does other things. And I'm just going to give a class on the Parsha so that people who tune in won't just miss a class. They'll be able to hear something at least.
Right. So everyone is welcome to join us for that, whether you normally join Rabbi Dr. Lieben's class or not. You can sign up on drisha.org as usual. And next week we have the Rappaport Family Memorial Lecture, which is at 12 p.m. We're going to be learning wonderful things about the Seder in preparation for Passover, and then Dr. Lieben's class will be at 1:30 that week to make time for the memorial lecture. For all of these amazing classes and much, much more, you can sign up at drisha.org, and I will see some of you later.
Can one use David Silber's link? Because I don't have LeBenz's link.
It's a different link, but if you go to drisha.org and sign up for the Midrash class, you will get the link for later today.
Okay. Thank you.